Good evening, everyone, and a very hearty welcome to all of you to Aurora online classes. Once again, I am back, and I am here to continue the same lesson. Means, what is your lesson? What I have to carry on? I have to carry on the same lesson. Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. This chapter is very big, and I still have to cover a long journey. So let's proceed with the lesson. Let's continue from there. In my previous class, I taught you that the blacks fought against the white supremacy under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. And the day of inauguration was a grand day. It was a historic day. It was a glorious day for the blacks because it was their victory. It was the victory of humanity for peace, justice, and human dignity. Dignity means respect. So actually, there was the huge gathering of the international leaders, and Nelson Mandela, actually, he was overwhelmed with the emotions, with a sense of history. In my previous class, I taught you on the day of inauguration, two national anthems were played. Two national anthems were sung. So you may ask as to why were two anthems sung, or why were two national anthems played on the day of inauguration. So though I have already made it clear to you, actually playing of these two national anthems shows the sense of unity, because there on 10th May 1994 a democratic non-racial government was installed, and on that particular day there was the end of apartheid. So that was the defeat of apartheid and the victory of non-racial government. You already know it. That is why two national anthems were played to propagate the message of, or to spread the message of unity. Now, be it blacks or be it whites or be it any other community in South Africa, they are no longer in no way are the victims of any kind of discrimination. Means there was no room for discrimination of any type. There was no place for discrimination of any sort. There were equal opportunities for all. That is why there was no discrimination. Number one, there was not a feeling of superiority and inferiority. All were equal. All were treated equally. It means in order to spread the sense of, or in order to provide, in order to give a message of unity, in order to give a message of togetherness, in order to give a message of unity, equality, and human dignity, two national anthems were played, one by the whites, other by the blacks on the day of inauguration. This is what I taught you earlier. Let's read further and try to understand. On the day of the inauguration, I was overwhelmed with a sense of history. Underline it. In the first decade of the 20th century, a few years after the bitter Anglo-Boer War and before my own birth, underline it, there was a war between Africans and the whites. Whites means Englishmen. And Africans, black Africans. Black Africans, they were the communities, aborigines of South Africa. So there was a war between the Englishmen and Africans, and the war between Englishmen and Africans is called Anglo-Boer War. So, a few years after the bitter Anglo-Boer War and before my own birth, the white-skinned peoples of South Africa patched up their differences. White-skinned means whites, Englishmen, and erected a system of racial domination against the dark-skinned peoples of their own land. Dark-skinned people here means the black communities, means the blacks, Kalelu. Actually, what happened? There was, and it happened, this Anglo-Boer War took place, occurred before the birth of Nelson Mandela, and he is quoting here that after this war, the whites means the Englishmen erected a structure. They formed their own government and they introduced the system of apartheid. And they imposed, who imposed? The whites imposed, the Englishmen imposed, because they were the rulers of South Africa after the Anglo-Boer War, and actually they fought against this apartheid, and the Englishmen imposed the domination, superiority, domination means superiority or rule, sasan. They imposed the domination of the whites over the majority population of South Africa. And this apartheid was based on racial discrimination and oppression. There is the word oppress. There is the word oppression. OPPRESSION. Oppression means exploitation, शोषण करना, दमन करना. So actually apartheid was, let me tell you very frankly, apartheid was based on the policy of racial discrimination and segregation. This discrimination based on color and race. There were two races, blacks and whites. They were the two races, isn't it? So racial discrimination, apartheid was based on racial discrimination. It was based on exploitation. It was based on brutality. It was based on tortures. So tortures, oppression, exploitation, cruelty, brutality are the common features of apartheid. And who imposed apartheid over the blacks of South Africa? The Englishmen imposed apartheid over a large population of the blacks and some other races in South Africa. And this was the harshest inhuman means anti-human system. The blacks were deprived of equal rights. They were deprived of their freedom. They were deprived of their equal rights, their values, their culture, and they were treated very badly. They were exploited. They were tortured. This is what I have already taught you. So after Anglo-Boer War, the power came to the white people, and they became the whites means the whites, white skin means the whites, Englishmen. They became the rulers of South Africa. And they denied all sorts of rights and freedom to the black people, black communities, and some other communities in South Africa. So they erected the structure they created, formed the basis of one of the harshest, most inhuman societies the world has ever known. What was the government? What was the structure? What was the formation? Who formed the government over in South Africa after the Anglo-Boer War? The white people, means the whites, the Englishmen, formed their government in South Africa, and they imposed apartheid. They introduced apartheid, and apartheid was based on exploitation, torture, cruelty, brutality, all sorts of exploitations, and all sorts of oppression. So apartheid was a very oppressive policy, very oppressive system. It oppressed and exploited the blacks of South Africa. So what was the harshest and most inhuman system, structure? Apartheid was. Apartheid was the harshest. It was a very harsh. It was a very harsh and inhuman. Inhuman means anti-human. It was against the blacks and other communities of South Africa. So this is the harshest and anti-human. Inhuman means anti-human system. And actually he is saying that in the first decade, and this war took place in the first decade of 20th century. First decade of 20th century means 1900 to 1910, and the last decade of 20th century means 1990 to 2000. This is the last decade of 20th century, and decade, you know, it is a duration of 10 years. Now in the last decade of the 20th century and my own 8th decade as a man, that system had been overturned forever and replaced by one that recognized the rights and freedoms of all peoples regardless of the color of their skin. What happened in the last decade of 20th century? Last decade of 20th century, there was a change. Apartheid was abolished, and then the democratic non-racial government came to power. And this democratic non-racial government came to power, and Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. This was the victory of the blacks over the whites. This was the victory of equality over discrimination. This was the victory of human dignity over racial segregation. So, in the last decade of 20th century, 1990 to 2000, this is the last decade. So, in the last decade of 20th century saw a drastic change in the system of South Africa. And what was the drastic change? You know, in the year 1994, 10th May, the democratic non-racial government under the leadership of Nelson Mandela was installed. It was formed. So this was a change, and this was a change. Such a government was installed where there was no discrimination, where there was no segregation, there was only equality for all. So actually the apartheid was abolished, and it was replaced by a new republic with the formation of a newly democratically elected government, which was non-racial. That day had come about